Early morning. Ponce, Puerto Rico. A marine interdiction specialist pressed a wrench against a steel plate and tapped twice. The sound came back wrong. Not the bright ring of an empty fuel tank. Something heavier. Something packed. She dropped a sounding rod down the access tube. 11 feet. The vessel plans said 22. Someone had sealed off half the forward void. And whatever was inside had been crossing the Caribbean for over a year. 3 weeks earlier, a Coast Guard cutter crew had climbed onto this same barge in darkness and found a man asleep between aggregate piles with a pistol and a duffel bag. No crew manifest. No explanation. Just a weapon and a bag he wouldn't let go of. That boarding triggered a case file. But what the sleeping man was guarding stayed hidden until one specialist noticed the measurements didn't match. The barge looked like the least interesting vessel in the Caribbean. Rust-streaked deck. Hauling cement and construction aggregate between the mainland and Ponce. Tracked by every port authority. Boarded by no one. The kind of industrial workhorse that moves through shipping lanes invisible. Which was exactly the strategy. And for 14 months, it worked. A barge was built to hide cargo. 3 agencies spent months investigating. On a July morning, federal agents cut open a compartment that wasn't supposed to exist. They found 524 pounds of cocaine, 2 rifles, and a marine radio programmed to a frequency no commercial operator would touch. The barge's name, invented here, was the Coastal Provider. Home port, San Juan. Operator, a company called Atlantic Cargo LLC, registered in Delaware, operating out of an office park in Fort Lauderdale. The vessel made regular runs. Mainland to Ponce. Aggregate, cement, construction materials. Dull cargo. Predictable route. No red flags. On paper, Atlantic Cargo had been operating since 2022. Clean record. Licensed. Insured. The barge itself, built in 1998, refitted in 2023. Or that's what the maintenance logs said. But that refit, carried out at a marine welding shop that would later become the center of a federal probe, wasn't standard maintenance. It was a modification. One that turned a commercial barge into a concealed freight system. The forward fuel void, a steel compartment, part of the vessel's original ballast and fuel storage design. In a standard configuration, it runs the length of the bow section, roughly 22 feet deep. Accessible through a single sounding tube for measuring fuel levels. Simple. Functional. But sometime in the spring of 2023, that void was cut open, replated, and welded into 2 separate chambers. The upper section, still accessible, still showing on diagrams. The lower section, sealed, dry, invisible to any sounding rod that dropped from the deck. 11 feet of concealed space. Enough to hold over 500 pounds of product and the weapons to protect it. The work was clean. The welds matched the original hull plate. A Coast Guard boarding inspection wouldn't catch it. A Port Authority fuel check wouldn't reach it. It was designed to be invisible. And for 14 months, it was. March 6, 2026. 3:12 a.m. Caribbean Sea, roughly 40 nautical miles north of Ponce. The Coast Guard cutter Reliance was running a standard patrol. No intelligence. No tip. Just a routine sector sweep. Officer Lucas Went, on deck watch, noticed the Coastal Provider under tow, heading south. Deck lights off. No visible crew. Standard for an unmanned tow, but something felt off. The barge sat low in the water. Too low for a vessel supposedly carrying aggregate. The displacement looked wrong. Went had been doing deck watch for 6 years, He knew what a loaded barge should look like. This one was riding 3, maybe 4 inches deeper than it should. He radioed the cutter's commander. Request to board. The boarding team climbed onto the deck at 3:27 a.m. Temperature, 71 degrees. Calm seas. The barge, quiet, dark, stacked with aggregate pallets and a small deckhouse at the stern. Went and 2 petty officers moved through the cargo area. No crew. No activity. Went noted the aggregate stacks. Standard industrial bags. 50-pound units. Properly secured. Nothing unusual. Then, near the forward section, behind a tarp-covered pallet stack, they found him. Male. Late 30s. Asleep in a nylon sleeping bag. Next to him, a 9mm Glock and a black duffel bag. Went shouted. The man woke, hands up immediately. No resistance. No explanation. Went secured the weapon, checked the duffel. Empty. Completely empty. The man gave a name later determined to be false. He said he'd been hired to watch the cargo during the tow. Paid in cash. Didn't know who hired him. Couldn't explain the gun. And couldn't explain why he'd guard an empty bag. Coast Guard detained him. Searched the barge. Found nothing else. No contraband. No hidden cargo. Just aggregate, cement, and one man with a weapon and an implausible story. He was arrested. The barge was released to continue its tow. Case file opened. But at that point, investigators thought they'd found a lone stowaway with a gun. They didn't yet know what he'd been guarding. The stowaway was transported to the Coast Guard station in San Juan. Processed. Photographed. Fingerprinted. His prints came back clean. No federal record. No state warrants. The name he'd given, Rafael Torres, belonged to a real person, but that person had died in a car accident in 2019. The man sitting in the holding cell wasn't Rafael Torres. He was someone else. Someone who'd bought or stolen a dead man's identity and used it to stay invisible. Coast Guard Investigative Service Agent Cara Delgado conducted the initial interview. Small room. Steel table. No windows. The man sat with his hands folded. Calm. Almost bored. Delgado started with the basics. Where are you from? The man said San Juan. Delgado asked where in San Juan. The man said Santurce. Delgado, who'd grown up in Santurce, asked which street. The man hesitated, then said he didn't remember the name. Delgado asked how long he'd lived there. The man said 5 years. Delgado asked what church was on the corner of his block. The man said he didn't go to church. Delgado asked what bus line ran through Santurce. The man said he didn't take the bus. Every answer, evasive, vague, designed to give nothing. Delgado switched tactics. She asked about the gun. The man said he found it on the barge. She asked about the duffel. The man said it was his. She asked what had been inside. The man said nothing. It had always been empty. Delgado asked why he'd sleep next to an empty bag with a loaded gun. The man said he was protecting his belongings. Delgado asked what belongings. The man pointed to the sleeping bag. That was it. That was all he had. Delgado didn't believe him. Neither did anyone else who read the transcript. But belief doesn't move a case. Evidence does. And at that point, there wasn't any. The file landed with Customs and Border Protection. Routine handoff. CBP Marine Interdiction Agent Ivelisse Arroyo reviewed the boarding report. The empty duffel stood out. Why guard an empty bag? She requested the vessel's maintenance and charter records. Routine background. The coastal provider, registered, clean, operating under Atlantic Cargo LLC. Arroyo ran the company. Incorporated 2022. Principals, 2 names, both tied to other maritime shell companies. Not illegal. Not unusual. But layered. Arroyo kept digging. The barge's last refit, April 2023, at a shop called Precision Marine Services, located in an industrial zone outside Fort Lauderdale. She cross-checked Port Authority records. The coastal provider had never docked at Fort Lauderdale in April 2023. The barge had been in San Juan that entire month, according to automated identification system logs. So how did a Fort Lauderdale welding shop bill for hull maintenance on a vessel that was never there? This was the discrepancy that would unravel the entire network. Arroyo flagged it. CBP elevated the case to Homeland Security investigations. HSI Special Agent Martin Colon took the file. He read it once. Then read it again. A stowaway with a gun. An empty duffel. A welding invoice for work performed on a vessel that wasn't present. Colon made a decision. Classify the case. Limit access. He read in 2 people. Arroyo, because she'd found the thread. And 1 HSI analyst, a woman named Claudia Reves, who specialized in maritime shell networks. For the next 9 weeks, only the 3 of them knew the coastal provider was under investigation. Reves started with the invoices. Precision Marine Services had billed Atlantic Cargo 11 times over 32 months. Each invoice detailed hull work, welding, structural repair. The language was technical, specific, believable. But Reves noticed something. Every invoice used identical phrasing. Hull integrity assessment and remedial welding per Marine Survey standards, word for word. 11 invoices. Same sentence. That kind of copy-paste repetition suggested the invoices weren't documenting real work. They were documenting payments disguised as work. Reves pulled the payment records. Every invoice paid within 14 days. Wire transfers. Clean. No flags. The money moved from Atlantic Cargo's account at Banco Popular in Miami to Precision Marine's account at a credit union in Fort Lauderdale. From there, the trail fractured. Precision Marine's account showed regular withdrawals. Cash. Large amounts. 10,000. 15,000. 20,000. Just under the threshold that would trigger a currency transaction report. The timing of the withdrawals matched the timing of the coastal provider's tow cycles. Every time the barge left Ponce, cash came out of the welding shop's account. Every time the barge returned, another invoice got paid. The pattern was clean and damning. Investigators went through the Coast Guard boarding logs frame by frame. One detail kept coming up: the empty duffel bag. Why would a stowaway guard an empty bag? The obvious answer: it wasn't empty when he boarded. Whatever had been inside was already gone, offloaded before the Coast Guard arrived. But that raised another question. If the cargo had already been moved, why was he still there? Why stay on a barge with a weapon, alone, in the middle of the Caribbean? The answer, once agents reconstructed the timeline, was simple. He wasn't supposed to be found. The tow schedule had been delayed by weather. The coastal provider should have docked in Ponce 2 days earlier. The handoff should have happened on shore. By the time the Coast Guard boarded, the plan had already fallen apart. The man with the duffel was waiting for an extraction that never came. Colon and Arroyo worked backward from the welding invoice. Precision Marine Services, a legitimate business, or at least it had been. Founded in 2018, specialized in hull repair and refits. The shop had done work for commercial operators, Coast Guard contractors, even a few Navy subcontractors. Nothing suspicious. But the billing records told a different story. Between April 2023 and January 2026, Precision Marine billed Atlantic Cargo LLC for 11 separate maintenance jobs. Total, $473,000. Every job listed hull maintenance or structural repair, and every single job was performed on vessels that were never physically present at the shop. The invoices were real. The payments cleared. But the work, at least the work as described, never happened. Arroyo and Revis pulled the payment trail. Atlantic Cargo paid Precision Marine through a business account at a Miami branch of Banco Popular. The account received regular deposits from another shell company, this one based in Panama. That Panamanian entity received wire transfers from 3 sources: a freight broker in Cartagena, a logistics company in Medellin, and a trading firm in Caracas. Standard layering. Standard money movement. But it all pointed back to one thing. The coastal provider wasn't just a barge. It was a line item in a logistics network. The welding shop billed for hull maintenance on a vessel that had never docked there. For 9 months, nobody flagged it. Not the bank. Not the IRS. Not the Coast Guard, even though the coastal provider was registered and tracked. The invoices sat in plain view. That gap between what should have triggered scrutiny and what actually did is where this operation lived. By late April 2026, Colon had enough to escalate. He briefed HSI Command. The case expanded. A second team joined, 4 agents, pulled from the HSI Miami field office, with experience in maritime interdiction and cartel logistics. The coastal provider became the target of a multi-agency operation. Coast Guard provided vessel tracking. CBP coordinated port surveillance. HSI led the investigation. But there was a problem. The barge was always moving. Mainland to Ponce, Ponce to mainland. A tow cycle every 11 to 14 days. To search the vessel properly, to confirm whether the hull had been modified, to locate any concealed compartments, agents needed the barge out of the water. That meant dry dock. And that meant waiting. The coastal provider wasn't scheduled for dry dock maintenance until July. 3 months away. Colon considered forcing the issue. HSI could seize the barge, haul it out of the water, conduct a full search. But that would burn the investigation. If the network realized federal agents had found the compartment, everyone connected to it would disappear. Colon wanted the vessel, the cargo, and the people. So he made the call: wait for the scheduled dry dock. Maintain surveillance. Let the network think it was still invisible. The surveillance operation ran out of a rented warehouse overlooking the Ponce port. 2 agents per shift. 12-hour rotations. Cameras mounted on the roofline, with telephoto lenses aimed at the dock where the coastal provider typically berthed. Every time the barge arrived, agents logged the time, the tow vessel, the crew present, the cargo offloaded, and anyone who approached the vessel during its docking window. The logs were meticulous. Time-stamped. Cross-referenced with Port Authority manifests and Coast Guard tracking data. Over 8 weeks, agents documented 37 individuals who came within 50 feet of the coastal provider. Most were dock workers, crane operators, cargo handlers. Routine. But 4 individuals stood out. They appeared multiple times. Always during off-peak hours. Always when the barge was docked, but the main cargo crew had left. One man in particular, mid-40s, stocky build, wearing a high-visibility vest that didn't match the Port Authority's standard-issue gear. He showed up 6 times. Each time, he boarded the barge, spent 10 to 15 minutes on deck, then left. No cargo moved. No maintenance performed. Just a man walking onto a barge and walking off. Agents ran his image through facial recognition. No hits. They checked port employee records. No match. Whoever he wasn't official. Cologne tagged him as a priority target. When the raid went down, that man needed to be identified and located. Because whatever he was doing on that barge during those 15-minute visits, it wasn't legitimate work. The wait gave the investigation team time to build the network map. Revs led the work. She tracked every entity connected to Atlantic Cargo. The Panamanian Shell Company dissolved in March 2026, 2 days after the Coast Guard boarding. The freight broker in Cartagena, a front operating out of a shared office space. The logistics company in Medellin, tied to a known cartel contractor. The trading firm in Caracas, linked to 3 other maritime smuggling cases dating back to 2021. The network wasn't new. It had been operating for years, moving product through commercial shipping lanes using modified vessels. The coastal provider was just one line. Investigators suspected there were others, but the barge was the only confirmed target. The only vessel they could prove had a concealed compartment. Everything else was inference. And inference doesn't get warrants. While Reeves built the financial map, Arroyo focused on the vessel itself. She requested the original construction blueprints from the shipyard that built the coastal provider in 1998. The blueprints showed the forward fuel void as a single continuous compartment. Depth, 22 feet. Accessible through a deck-mounted sounding tube. Standard configuration. Then Arroyo requested the refit plans filed with the Coast Guard in May 2023 after the alleged maintenance at Precision Marine. The refit plans showed the same configuration. Same depth. Same access points. No modifications noted. But Arroyo had a hunch. She wanted to measure the void herself. The coastal provider docked in Ponce on May 9, 2026. Standard cargo run. Unloading aggregate. The vessel was scheduled to remain docked for 36 hours before the next tow. Arroyo coordinated with CBP at the Ponce port. She arrived early, 0600 hours, with a sounding rod and a portable tape measure. The morning was humid. Low clouds. The port was quiet. Arroyo approached the barge. No crew present. The gangway was down. She climbed aboard. The deck was empty. Crew offloaded. Arroyo walked to the bow section. Located the forward-sounding tube. A steel cap, bolted down, slightly corroded around the threads. She unscrewed the cap, set it aside, and pulled the sounding rod from her kit. Standard tool. Graduated markings every 6 inches. She fed the rod down the tube. It dropped smooth. No resistance. Then it stopped. She checked the marking. 11 feet, 2 inches. She pulled the rod, wiped it clean, dropped it again. Same result. 11 feet. She consulted the blueprints. The plan said 22 feet. Arroyo walked to the bow, knelt at the hull plate near the waterline. She pulled a wrench from her kit and tapped the plate twice. The sound came back dull. Dead. She moved aft 3 feet and tapped again. This time, a bright metallic ring. The sound of an empty void. She returned to the first spot and tapped again. Dull. Packed. She called Cologne. Told him what she'd found. Cologne asked if she was certain. Arroyo said yes. The forward void had been cut and replated. Roughly 11 feet of concealed space, sealed below the accessible section. Colon asked if there was any way to confirm without cutting the hull. Arroyo said no. To know for sure, they'd have to open it. That confirmation moved the case into operational planning. HSI Command authorized a full takedown. Target: the coastal provider and anyone connected to its operation. Plan: wait for the July dry dock, when the barge would be hauled out of the water at a facility in Ponce for scheduled maintenance. At that point, with the vessel on keel stands, agents could safely cut into the hull and access the concealed compartment. If the compartment held what investigators suspected, arrests would follow immediately. But the plan had a flaw. The network didn't know the barge was compromised, but it would know the moment federal agents swarmed a dry dock with cutting torches. The window between opening the compartment and making arrests would be minutes. Maybe less. Anyone not physically present at the dry dock would have time to run. Colon needed to know who to arrest before the raid started. That's where the investigation hit a wall. The financial trail led to shell companies and dissolved entities. The welding shop, Precision Marine, had shuttered in March 2026, right after the Coast Guard boarding. The principals behind Atlantic Cargo were names on incorporation papers, nothing more. The freight broker, the logistics company, the trading firm, all fronts. No real people. No addresses. No one to arrest. Colon needed an insider. Someone who could be identified, located, and taken into custody the moment the raid went down. He sent agents back to Precision Marine Services. The shop was closed, but the property records showed the business had leased a warehouse bay in an industrial complex. The lease had been paid through June 2026. The space was still technically active. Agents surveilled the location. Nothing. The bay was empty, locked, no activity. But the lease payments were still clearing. Someone was still paying rent on a closed business. Colon pulled the bank records for the lease payments. They traced back to a personal checking account held by a man named Esteban Ruiz, age 43, a licensed marine welder with an address in Dania Beach, Florida. Ruiz had been the lead welder at Precision Marine from 2021 to 2026. He'd filed for business closure in March. No criminal record. No prior federal contact. But his checking account had received 3 wire transfers between April 2023 and February 2026, totaling $192,000, all from the same Panamanian shell company that funded Atlantic Cargo. Colon had his insider. Or at least, he had the man who'd cut the compartment. Agents pulled Ruiz's financial records. Bank statements. Credit card transactions. Tax returns. The wire transfers were the largest deposits in his account history. Prior to April 2023, Ruiz had been earning a steady but modest income. $48,000 a year. Typical for a skilled welder working commercial marine contracts. Then the first wire hit. $72,000. One deposit. No explanation. No invoice. Just money. 2 months later, another $60,000. Then, in February 2026, the final transfer, $60,000 more. After each deposit, Ruiz's spending changed. He bought a truck. Paid cash. $29,000. He paid off a mortgage. Sent money to family in the Dominican Republic. Bought a boat. A 23-foot center console. $41,000. Cash. No financing. For a man earning less than $50,000 a year, that kind of spending didn't add up. Unless you knew where the money came from. Simple compartment. Simple route. greed. That was the whole strategy. What's remarkable is how long Basic worked. The hull modification was clean, but it wasn't sophisticated. Any marine surveyor doing a full inspection would have caught the discrepancy. But nobody did a full inspection. The coastal provider ran a predictable route, carried dull cargo, and stayed below the threshold of scrutiny. That's the real vulnerability, not the technology, not the complexity. Just the sheer volume of commercial traffic moving through shipping lanes, and the fact that most of it never gets checked. By mid-June 2026, the investigation had identified 3 targets for arrest. Esteban Ruiz, the welder who modified the hull. A dispatcher named Carlos Ortega, employed by the towing company that moved the coastal provider between ports, whose phone records showed he'd been feeding live tow schedules to an unknown number for 14 months. And a man listed as Atlanti Cargo's operations manager, David Montez, whose role investigators believed was coordinating cargo transfers at the Ponce end. But there was a complication. Ruiz had stopped showing up at his Dania Beach address in early May. Surveillance teams confirmed the residence was empty. No activity. No vehicles. Neighbors said he'd left weeks ago. No forwarding information. Ortega was still active, still working his dispatcher job, unaware he was under investigation. Montez, also active, living in Ponce, going to work every day. But Ruiz, the man who could testify to exactly how the compartment was built and who paid him to build it, was gone. Colón issued a federal warrant for Ruiz on June 19th, unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. But the warrant was sealed. No public record. Colón didn't want to spook the rest of the network. Ruiz could run. The others couldn't. Not yet. The economics matter. A modified hull costs maybe $50,000. One successful run pays that back 8 times over. The return on investment is so high that losing one vessel is just a cost of doing business. Even if the coastal provider got seized, even if everyone connected to it got arrested, the model still works. For every one barge that gets caught, a dozen others are running clean. That's the math. And it's why this kind of smuggling won't stop, even when individual networks get dismantled. The Coast Guard boarding in March was pure luck. No intelligence. No tip. Just a random patrol in the right sector at 3 in the morning. If that cutter hadn't been there, if Officer Wendt hadn't noticed the lights were off, this barge would still be running. That raises a hard question. Do you think a random patrol should count as good interdiction, or does it show the system is reactive, not proactive? There's a case for both. But the fact remains, the only reason this network got caught was because one crew happened to be in the right place. Not because the system detected it. The dry dock raid was scheduled for July 14th. But the operational planning started weeks before. HSI Command assigned a tactical coordinator, a former Navy investigator named Stephen Carver, to coordinate the timing of the raid with arrests at 3 locations. The timing had to be exact. Cut the hull in Ponce at 0700 hours. Arrest Montez at his residence at the same moment. Arrest Ortega at his office in Fort Lauderdale simultaneously. If any one piece moved before the others, the network would scatter. Carver built a timeline, minute by minute. Who would be where? Who would do what? Which teams would handle which targets? He rehearsed it twice with the full team. Agents practiced the hull cut on a decommissioned barge at a federal training facility. The cutting crew timed themselves. 40 minutes from first torch to open plate. Carver added a 15-minute buffer. His window, 0700 to 0800 hours. Extraction complete by 0830. Arrests executed simultaneously across 3 locations. No room for delay. July 14, 2026. The coastal provider was scheduled for dry dock maintenance at a facility in Ponce, operated by a contractor called Caribe Marine Works. The barge arrived on tow the night before, was hauled out of the water at 0600 hours, and placed on keel stands in the yard's main service bay. Standard procedure. The contractor's crew prepared to begin routine hull inspection and paint work. At 0545, before the contractor's crew arrived, a convoy of federal vehicles moved into position around the dry dock. HSI agents, CBP officers, Coast Guard Investigative Service, Ponce Municipal Police provided perimeter security. 2 gates sealed. No one in or out. At 0612, as the first contractor employees arrived for work, agents identified themselves and secured the site. No resistance. The contractor's supervisor was briefed. Federal operation. The barge was evidence. The crew was instructed to stand by. At 0630, a CBP marine engineer and a contracted cutting crew, working under federal supervision, began cutting into the forward hull section. The cutting took 40 minutes. Oxyacetylene torches, working through plate steel. The air smelled like burning metal and diesel residue. Sparks cascaded off the hull and scattered across the concrete pad. The cutting crew worked in sequence. First cut, vertical, following the interior seam where the false plate had been welded. Second cut, horizontal, separating the plate from the hull frame. Third cut, vertical again, completing the rectangle. At 0710, the first plate was removed. Agents directed floodlights into the void. Inside, 524 pounds of cocaine, packaged in shrink-wrapped bricks, stacked on wooden dunnage to keep the product off the hull floor. 2 rifles, both AR platform, wrapped in plastic. A handheld marine radio, battery dead, programmed to a frequency outside the commercial VHF band. And a nylon duffel bag, identical to the one the Coast Guard had found in March. This one wasn't empty. It held $73,000 in cash, bundled in $20 bills. Agents photographed the compartment, documented every item. Then began the extraction. The cocaine was removed brick by brick, cataloged, and loaded into evidence vehicles. Each brick weighed approximately 1 kilogram. The packaging was uniform, professional. Each brick stamped with a small logo, a stylized eagle. The same logo had appeared in 2 prior interdiction cases, both involving Venezuelan cartel networks. The rifles were secured. Serial numbers recorded. Both had been reported stolen from a freight warehouse in Laredo, Texas, in November 2024. The radio and cash, bagged and tagged. The entire process, from first cut to final evidence log, took 2 hours and 18 minutes. While the extraction was underway, coordinated arrests happened simultaneously. In Ponce, David Montez, taken into custody at his residence at 0730. Agents entered the home with a warrant. Montez was in the kitchen. No resistance. Agents found a laptop, 3 cell phones, and a ledger notebook with handwritten entries detailing tow schedules, cargo weights, and payment amounts. The notebook became a key piece of evidence. Every entry matched a known tow cycle of the coastal provider. In Fort Lauderdale, Carlos Ortega, arrested at his dispatcher's office at 007-45. Ortega was on shift when agents arrived. He tried to delete files from his computer. Agents stopped him. Forensic analysis would later recover the files, spreadsheets with vessel tracking data, tow schedules, and coordinates for offshore transfer points. In Dania Beach, agents executed a search warrant at Esteban Ruiz's last known address. Residence was empty, as expected. Ruiz remained a fugitive. At the dry dock, 3 additional arrests. The contractor's site supervisor, who investigators later determined had accepted payments to ensure the coastal provider was assigned to specific service bays where hull work could be observed and, if necessary, adjusted. A dock worker who'd been feeding the network information about CBP inspection schedules. And a man found in a storage shed adjacent to the dry dock, later identified as the relief guard who was supposed to board the barge during the next tow cycle. He had a pistol, an empty duffel, and instructions written on a scrap of paper. The instructions were brief. Board after offload. Secure forward. Wait for call. No names. No details. Just enough to do the job. Not enough to implicate anyone else. Total: 6 arrested. 1 fugitive. The coastal provider seized. The largest single piece of evidence agents had ever had to move with a crane. The compartment itself became a case study. After the cocaine and weapons were removed, federal engineers documented the modification in detail. The original fuel void had been cut horizontally at the 11-foot mark. A new steel plate was welded across the interior, creating a false bottom. The lower section, sealed, dry, accessible only by cutting through the hull from the outside. The upper section, still functional, still showing the correct fuel levels when measured from the deck. The welds were continuous. No gaps. No obvious seams. The steel used for the false plate matched the hull's original specification. 1/4-inch marine-grade plate. The same material used in the rest of the vessel. Whoever cut that compartment knew what they were doing. The modification was clean enough that it had passed 2 Coast Guard inspections and multiple Port Authority checks over 14 months. Nobody had caught it until Arroyo dropped a sounding rod and noticed the depth was wrong. The cocaine lab analysis confirmed purity at 87%. Street value, if broken down and distributed retail, approximately $11.4 million. The rifles, traced to a batch reported stolen from a freight warehouse in Texas in 2024. The marine radio, frequency analysis showed it matched a channel used in 3 other maritime interdiction cases between 2022 and 2025, all involving cartel logistics networks operating in the Caribbean. The cash in the duffel, $73,000. Not enough to fund an operation this size. Investigators believed it was operational money, payment for the guards, the dock supervisor, the dispatcher. The real money, the profits from prior runs, had already been moved. Where it went remained unknown. Federal prosecutors charged all 6 arrested individuals with conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, possession with intent to distribute, smuggling, and firearms offenses. Montes and Ortega, additional charges related to their roles in coordinating the network. The dock supervisor, bribery and obstruction. The relief guard, possession of a firearm in furtherance of drug trafficking. All 6 pleaded not guilty. Trial dates set for early 2027. Esteban Ruiz, federal arrest warrant remains active. Last confirmed sighting, Miami International Airport, May 12, 2026, 3 days after Arroyo measured the fuel void in Ponce. Surveillance footage showed him boarding a flight to Panama City. After that, nothing. Investigators believe he was tipped off, though by whom remains unclear. The timing suggests someone within the network knew the investigation was active. Whether that someone was inside law enforcement or just well connected within the smuggling network is still under review. Ruiz is considered a fugitive. Interpol notice issued. But Panama has no extradition treaty with the United States for non-violent drug offenses. Unless Ruiz leaves Panama, he's out of reach. The financial network behind Atlantic Cargo, partially traced, mostly dissolved. The Panamanian shell company, the freight broker in Cartagena, the logistics firm in Medellin, all ceased operations between March and June 2026. Bank accounts, closed or emptied. The trading firm in Caracas, still operating, but investigators haven't established enough evidence to pursue charges. The money trail goes cold at the wire transfers. Estimated total moved through the network over 14 months, at least $43 million. Recovered, $73,000. The coastal provider itself, held as evidence. Too large to store in a federal facility, the barge remains at the Cary Bay Marine Works dry dock in Ponce, under 24-hour guard, while legal proceedings continue. If convictions are secured, the vessel will be auctioned. Proceeds go to the Federal Asset Forfeiture Fund. If not, it returns to the last registered owner, a shell entity that no longer exists. Coast Guard and CBP have since reviewed protocols for commercial barge inspections. The fuel void modification technique, cutting a horizontal false bottom into a vertical tank, has been added to interdiction training. Marine surveyors at major ports have been briefed. But the Caribbean remains one of the highest traffic maritime corridors in the world. Thousands of commercial vessels move through those lanes every month. Most are exactly what they appear to be. Some aren't. And the gap between those two categories is where networks like this one operate. The charter company and welding shop remain unnamed because the federal investigation extends to related vessels. Investigators believe the coastal provider wasn't the only modified barge in this network. At least 2 other vessels, operated under different shell companies but linked through the same financial entities, are under investigation. One vessel, a cement carrier operating between Venezuela and Trinidad, was flagged after showing the same billing pattern, invoices for maintenance work performed at facilities the vessel never visited. Another, a cargo barge running between Colombia and Jamaica, is under surveillance. No searches yet. No arrests. But the pattern is there. And when the pattern repeats, the network becomes visible. At the time of writing, 5 of the 6 arrested individuals remain in federal custody awaiting trial. 1. The relief guard found in the storage shed accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony. His cooperation is sealed. What he's told investigators hasn't been made public. But his willingness to cooperate suggests there's more to this network than what was found in one compartment on one barge. In his proffer session, sealed but summarized in court filings, the guard described a system where multiple vessels operated simultaneously, each with rotating guards who never knew the full route or the full network. Compartmentalized. Disposable. If one guard got caught, he couldn't compromise the others because he didn't know who they were. The man arrested by the Coast Guard in March, the stowaway with the gun and the empty duffel, was charged separately. He pleaded guilty to being a felon in possession of a firearm and received a 41-month sentence. He refused to cooperate. Refused to identify who hired him. Refused to explain what was in the duffel when he boarded. Investigators believe he was paid to stay silent. How much, and by whom, remains unknown. Ivelisse Arroyo, the CBP Marine interdiction specialist who measured the fuel void and heard the wrong sound, received a commendation from HSI for her role in the investigation. She continues to work in the Ponce field office. In interviews after the case, she said the one thing that stayed with her was how ordinary the barge looked. Rust-streaked. Unremarkable. The kind of vessel you'd see 100 times and never think twice about. That ordinariness, she said, was the whole point. The network is dismantled. The compartment is open. The barge is seized. The model, though, doesn't die. Because, for every barge that gets caught, the economics still work for the next one. The Caribbean is still there. The shipping lanes are still crowded. Somewhere, another hull is being modified for another run, because the profit margins make this worth doing again and again. One wrong sound. 11 feet of steel. 524 pounds sealed inside a fuel void nobody was supposed to measure. That's what it took to crack this case. Not advanced surveillance. Not informants. Just one agent with a sounding rod and the instinct to check the numbers twice. Whether there are more networks like this one running right now, in plain view, waiting for someone to notice the sound is wrong, that's the question nobody